The night was colder than usual in Los Angeles, the kind of cold that seeps through even the thickest blankets. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over an almost empty parking lot. In one corner, barely noticeable, sat an old, beaten-down car. The windows were fogged from the warmth of breath inside, but if you looked closely, you'd see them. A young mother and her baby, wrapped in layers of whatever they could find. She held her child close, whispering soft lullabies, trying to ignore the growling hunger in her own stomach. She had done everything she could, but life had thrown her too many obstacles. She had nowhere else to go. Most people walked past without a second glance. To them, she was just another unfortunate soul, another story they'd rather not think about. But one man did stop, a man the world knew, a man who had walked red carpets, starred in blockbuster films, and was adored by millions. Yet at this moment, he was just a person who saw another human in need. Keanu Reeves, the beloved Hollywood star, noticed the car and the woman inside. Something in the way she clutched her baby, the exhaustion in her posture, made him pause. It was late, and he had just wrapped up a long day, but something in his heart wouldn't let him walk away. Keanu wasn't the type to turn a blind eye to suffering. He had been through his own hardships, losing loved ones, battling grief, and facing struggles most people never knew about. Maybe that's why he could recognize the quiet pain in someone else's eyes. As he stood there, watching from a distance, he knew he couldn't just walk away. But how do you approach someone in such a vulnerable state without scaring them? How do you offer help without making them feel small? He took a deep breath and walked toward the car, making sure not to come too close too fast. The woman inside noticed him immediately. Her eyes widened in fear, gripping her baby just a little tighter. Was this a threat? Was this someone about to tell her to move, to leave the only shelter she had? She had been through this before. Judgmental stares, harsh words, people assuming the worst about her. She braced herself for what was coming next. But instead of anger or disgust, Keanu's voice was soft. "Hey, I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his hands up slightly to show he meant no harm. "I just wanted to check if you're okay." The woman didn't respond at first. She wasn't sure if she should trust him. In her experience, kindness often came with conditions, but there was something different about this man. His eyes weren't filled with pity, just genuine concern. Keanu could see her hesitation, so he took another step back, giving her space. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he continued. I noticed you've been here for a while, and I thought maybe you could use some help." Her lips trembled, as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. She looked down at her baby, asleep in her arms, before finally whispering, "We're fine." Keanu could tell that wasn't true. He had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone was just trying to hold on. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some cash. "I don't want to overstep," he said, placing it gently on the hood of the car. "Just in case you need something. No pressure." She looked at the money but didn't take it. Instead, she looked back at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But there was none. For the first time in a long time, someone was offering help without expecting anything in return. Before she could decide what to do, something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything. The woman stared at the cash sitting on the hood of her car, her fingers tightening around her baby's small body. It wasn't the first time someone had offered her money, but usually it came with judgment, side glances, whispers, or condescending words. This time, it felt different. The man in front of her wasn't pressuring her, wasn't making her feel like a burden. Still, accepting help wasn't easy for her. Keanu noticed her hesitation and took another step back, his hands slipping into his jacket pockets. The cold air nipped at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on the woman and the silent battles she seemed to be fighting within herself. He understood that pride and survival often went hand in hand. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Why?" Her voice was quiet, cautious. "Why do you care?" Keanu gave a small smile, not the kind meant to charm, just one filled with sincerity. "Because I've been there," he admitted. His words hung in the air, heavier than she expected. He could have easily walked away, let her figure things out on her own, but he didn't. He wasn't just offering her money. He was offering something much deeper. The woman, still clutching her child, felt a lump rise in her throat. She had learned not to trust easily. Too many promises had been broken, too many people had let her down. But something about Keanu's presence made her feel safe, even if only for a moment. She glanced at her baby, peaceful despite the world crumbling around them. She had done everything to keep him safe, but sleeping in a car every night, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, was no life for a child. Tears stung her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I'm just trying to get through the night," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded, understanding more than she realized. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. She hesitated. It had been so long since someone asked her that without any expectations. "Emily," she finally answered. "That's a beautiful name," Keanu said sincerely. He looked down at the baby wrapped tightly in a small, tattered blanket. "And this little guy?" Emily hesitated again, but there was something about this man that made her want to open up, even if just a little. "Liam," she said softly. "He's almost a year old." Keanu smiled. "Liam's a strong name." He looked back at Emily, the exhaustion on her face impossible to ignore. "Listen, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but if you need a warm place to sleep tonight, I can help." Emily's heart pounded. Was this real? Was she actually standing here, talking to Keanu Reeves, and was he really offering to help her? Her mind screamed to say no. Accepting help meant trusting someone, and she had been burned too many times before. But then she looked at Liam, his tiny face relaxed in sleep, unaware of the harsh world around him. She couldn't keep pretending they were okay. Her lips parted to say something, but then, "Bam!" A sudden loud knock on the window startled them both. Emily flinched, instinctively shielding Liam. Her heart raced as she turned toward the noise. A man stood outside the car, his face hidden under a hood, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. Keanu immediately stepped in front of Emily, his protective instincts kicking in. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The man didn't respond right away. He glanced at Emily, then back at Keanu. "Didn't expect to see you here," he muttered under his breath. There was something off about him, his stance, the way his eyes flickered between them. Emily swallowed hard. She recognized him. Not personally, but he was one of the guys who had been hanging around the lot lately. She had done her best to avoid them, but she knew better than to ignore warning signs. Keanu noticed the shift in her posture. He didn't know the full story, but he didn't need to. "Everything okay?" he asked her softly. Emily barely nodded, her pulse still racing. She had dealt with enough people to know when someone was looking for trouble. The man's presence made her uneasy, and the last thing she wanted was for Keanu to get involved in something dangerous. But Keanu wasn't the type to back down. He took a small step forward, keeping his body between Emily and the stranger. "If there's a problem, we can talk about it," he said, his voice steady. The man let out a low chuckle. "No problem," he muttered, backing away slightly. But there was something about the way he said it that made Emily's stomach twist. After a long, tense moment, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. But Emily knew it wasn't over. Keanu waited until the man was out of sight before turning back to her. "Do you know him?" Emily exhaled shakily. "Not really. Just. People like him come around sometimes." She bit her lip. "That's why I don't stay in one place too long." Keanu understood immediately. This wasn't just about being homeless. It was about survival, about avoiding the wrong people. And now, it was clear that staying in this parking lot wasn't safe. He glanced at the car, then at Emily. "Come with me," he said, more certain than before. "You and Liam shouldn't be out here." Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to run, to stay hidden, to rely on no one. But then she looked at her baby. Liam stirred slightly in his sleep, unaware of the fear gripping his mother's heart. She couldn't keep doing this. She took a deep breath, looking up at Keanu. There was no pity in his eyes, no pressure, just patience, a kind of kindness she hadn't seen in a long time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she decided to take a chance. She nodded. "Okay." Keanu's expression softened. "Okay," he echoed. "Let's go." But neither of them knew that this was only the beginning. Because the moment Emily decided to trust him, everything was about to change, more than either of them could have imagined. And what happened next would shock them both. As Emily held Liam close, she followed Keanu toward his car, her steps hesitant but filled with a quiet desperation. She had spent so long surviving on her own, but something inside her told her this was different. The night was still cold, and the wind cut through her thin sweater, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a small flicker of hope. Keanu opened the passenger door, making sure she was comfortable before getting into the driver's seat. He didn't ask too many questions. He could see she was exhausted. Instead, he turned up the heat, letting the warm air fill the space. Emily sank into the seat, her body finally relaxing, but her mind was still racing. Was this real? Was she really sitting in a car with Keanu Reeves, being offered a chance to get off the streets? They drove in silence for a while, the city lights passing by in a blur. Liam stirred in her arms but remained asleep, his tiny fingers curled into her sweater. Keanu glanced over at them, his heart heavy. He had met a lot of people in his life, but something about Emily's situation hit him harder than most. Maybe it was because he knew what loss felt like. Maybe it was because he had seen his own struggles reflected in the way she carried herself, strong but tired. Eventually, he pulled into a quiet parking lot next to a small hotel. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, turning to her. "You and Liam need a safe place to rest." Emily looked at him, unsure. "Keanu, I can't." He stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "No arguments. It's already done." Tears welled up in her eyes. She had spent so long fighting to survive that she had forgotten what kindness felt like. Before she could say anything, he got out of the car and walked into the lobby. A few minutes later, he came back with a keycard in hand. Inside, the room was small but warm. The bed looked like the softest thing Emily had seen in months. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Keanu set down a bag of food he had picked up along the way and looked at her with a reassuring smile. "You're safe here," he said. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She sat down on the bed, rocking Liam gently as she watched Keanu take a seat across from her. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was filled with understanding. Finally, she spoke. "I wasn't always like this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had a job, an apartment, a plan." She let out a shaky breath, but then Liam's father left. Bills piled up. "I lost my job, then my home. One thing after another, until this was all that was left." Keanu listened, never interrupting, just letting her speak. She had held everything inside for so long, but now, in this small, warm room, she felt safe enough to let it out. She wiped at her eyes, embarrassed. "I don't even know why I'm telling you all this." "Because sometimes, we just need someone to listen," Keanu said softly. Emily exhaled, staring down at her sleeping baby. "I just want him to have a better life." Keanu leaned forward. "He will," he said firmly, "and you will too." She looked up at him, wanting to believe his words but afraid to hope. "How?" Keanu hesitated for only a moment before making a decision. "I have a friend," he said. "She runs a program for single mothers. They help with housing, jobs, childcare, everything." He met her eyes. "I want to help you get back on your feet, Emily, if you'll let me." Emily felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. No one had ever offered her something like this before. Not just money, not just temporary help, but a way out, a real chance. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time, they weren't just from sadness. They were from something she hadn't felt in a long time, relief. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Keanu smiled. "I want to." And in that moment, Emily knew that her life was about to change. The next few days passed in a blur. Keanu made good on his promise. He connected her with his friend, who helped her find a temporary apartment. He made sure she had food, clothing, and a safe place for Liam. With their support, she applied for jobs and started building a future she had once thought was impossible. Keanu didn't do it for recognition. He didn't tell the media, didn't post about it. He simply did what he felt was right. And when Emily finally stood in the doorway of her new home, holding Liam with a smile that reached her eyes, he knew he had done the right thing. As he prepared to leave, Emily stopped him. "Keanu," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said simply. "Just take care of Liam and yourself." She nodded, holding her baby close. "I will." Keanu smiled. "Then that's all that matters." As he walked away, Emily watched him go, knowing she would never forget this moment. Because sometimes, the kindness of one person could change everything. And what Keanu Reeves had done for her and Liam was something she would carry in her heart forever.